Hello and welcome. You're watching World Panorama, a show where you get a complete roundup of all the big international news stories that unfolded this week. I'm Aishwarya with you. Let us begin the program with this week's top stories in the headlines. Hong Kong protests escalate, come to central financial district, universities, colleges. Public transport severely affected. After a student died last week, another man killed during clashes. Government vows to take decisive measures to stop violence. Hopes of political crisis in Bolivia are being resolved. Agreement reached between interim government and party of unseated leader Evo Morales to pursue new elections. Ceasefire between Israel and militants in Gaza holding despite launch of rockets. Truce ended 2 days of intense fighting in which 34 Palestinians were killed in crossfire. Australia reels from deadly bushfires, drought, 4 people dead in this year's blazes. Fears of more strong blazes as temperatures forecast to pick up again into the weekend. After a month of relative calm, terrorist attacks flare up in Kabul, 12 killed in car bombing. Attack a day after Afghan government's prisoner exchange with the Taliban insurgents in the hope of reviving peace talks. Our top stories from Hong Kong this week saw a marked escalation in violence with intense street battles, violent clashes at universities and flash bomb lunchtime protests. It is the first time in weeks that protests are taking place during weekdays. There were several flashpoints, including an activist being shot by the police, a man dying after being hit on the head, and a pro-government supporter set on fire by the protesters. Last week, a 22-year-old student had died after falling from a building during a police operation. Hong Kong's government has vowed to take decisive measures to stop violence, and Chinese President Xi Jinping has also issued a strong warning to the protesters.
It was another turbulent week of protests in Hong Kong. The unrest this week began with a citywide strike on Monday. Commuters faced chaotic conditions and severe delays as anti-government protesters pushed hard to enforce a strike. Much of the city's public transport was suspended. Many subways and rail stations closed after the protesters blocked commuters and vandalized trains.
We are very angry about the regime and the government who is trying to stop us from living in a way that we live. And they are trying to suppress our voice. And as a result, today we are here. We are calling for the general strike of all Hong Kong people to stop the regime from continuous suppression of our life.
3 separate violent events appear to be catalysts of this week's mayhem. Police on Monday shot an unarmed protester at close range. A man who confronted protesters was doused with petrol and set on fire. A police officer appeared to drive his motorcycle into a crowd.
We have not succeeded since the movement began in June. 5 demands and more had been added, including reforming the police force. We will not give up until justice is served.
The situation has affected a large number of local people going to work or school. The protesters intending to paralyze Hong Kong, stop Hong Kong and make people unable to go to school or work are extremely selfish.
香港停擺咗，不能夠返工、不能夠返學嘅現象係極為自私嘅。
Unrest broke out at universities and many schools closed for the day. There was action also on the university grounds at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Police fired tear gas and rubber bullets as protesters started fire and threw petrol bombs. Through the night, there were chaotic scenes of explosions, smoke, and rubber bullet gunfire, during which scores were injured. Protest continues on Wednesday as well, with clashes in different parts of the city.
Hong Kong's rule of law has been pushed to the brink of total collapse as masked rioters recklessly escalate their violence under the false hope that they can get away with it.
However, China issued its firm support for Hong Kong's police and also hit out at US and Britain for denouncing Hong Kong police's action.
The central government firmly supports the Hong Kong government in implementing policies according to the law, supports the Hong Kong police to strictly enforce the law. Hong Kong's affairs are purely China's internal affairs. No foreign government, organization or individual has a right to interfere.
The Chinese-ruled city is experiencing its 6th month of protest, which was sparked by a controversial extradition bill which has morphed into a wider pro-democracy movement. 5 months of non-stop violence and protests have pushed Hong Kong into an economic crisis, and the city officially fell into recession last month. The government has implemented measures to try and support the impacted business, but with no end in sight, the city is bracing for further economic loss. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
And this week, Bolivia saw another week of chaos. President Evo Morales resigned amid turmoil following his disputed re-election last month. He took political asylum in Mexico. Then, Deputy Head of the Senate, Jeanine Áñez, declared herself as interim president until new elections are held. However, there was violence again after supporters of Morales launched a campaign to reinstate him to power. But now there are hopes of some solution to the South American country's political crisis. On Thursday, Bolivia's interim government and Morales' party struck a deal to pursue new elections. Police and military patrolling the streets of La Paz as political uncertainty continues in Bolivia after President Evo Morales resigned and flew out of the country to Mexico to take up political asylum there. Bolivian opposition Senator Jeanine Áñez has declared herself interim president of the South American country following Morales' resignation.
We are facing a presidential succession originating from the vacancy of the presidency of this state due to definitive absence of the president and the vice president. As president of the Chambers of Senators, I immediately assumed the presidency of the state as foreseen in the constitutional order.
Evo Morales resigned after nearly 14 years in power. Pressure had been growing on him since his narrow victory in last month's presidential election. The country's first indigenous leader may have given a voice to millions of Bolivians, but he lost his support with what many felt was an increasingly undemocratic way of ruling. The last straw being accusations of electoral fraud. On Sunday, events moved swiftly. First, the Organization of American States announced that its audit of the election had found clear manipulation and called for the result to be annulled. In response, Morales agreed to hold fresh elections. But his main rival, Carlos Mesa, who came second in the vote, said that Morales should not stand in any new vote. What really seemed to tip the balance was the intervention of the Chief of the Armed Forces, General William Scaliman, who urged Morales to step down in the interests of peace and stability. Announcing his resignation, Morales said he had taken the decision in order to stop fellow socialist leaders from being harassed, persecuted and threatened. He also called his removal a coup. The President and Senate President of the country also resigned.
I also want to tell you, brothers and sisters, while I have life, we will stay in politics. While I have life, the fight will continue.
Protesters took to the streets to celebrate, chanting, "Yes, we could," and setting off firecrackers. Bolivia has been rattled by weeks of anti-government protests following the reports of election fraud. Morales' resignation met with mixed reaction from world leaders. US President Donald Trump described it as a significant moment for democracy in the Western Hemisphere. The Cuban and Venezuelan leaders condemned the events as a coup. Spain also expressed its concern over the role of Bolivia's army.
Y apareció una señorona por allá.
We denounced the coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia, financed and directed from the White House, just like all the coups in Latin America and the Caribbean in the last 100 years and more, with all the coups.
Evo Morales está de presidente en este periodo con más del 60%.
Morales, who was Bolivia's first indigenous president, had served as leader since 2006. He ran for a fourth consecutive term in the October elections after a controversial decision by the Constitutional Court to scrap presidential term limits. With Morales now in Mexico, the chapter of the longest-standing president currently in Latin America is now closed. But the next chapter in Bolivia's political history is very unclear. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. The Gaza Strip this week saw 2 days of the most intense fighting for months. The violence was triggered when Israel killed Baha Abu al-Atta, a militant leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad group. The group then fired close to 400 rockets at Israel, causing Israel to strike back with airstrikes. 34 Palestinians were killed in the exchange of fire, Israel saying that 25 of the Palestinian fatalities were militants. A ceasefire was announced, brokered with the help of United Nations and Egypt, as the flare-up raised fears of a new all-out conflict. While a fragile truce holds, there have been reports of fresh airstrikes by Israel on PIJ militant group targets.
We are approaching the end of the operation. I praise the Israeli security forces for a great achievement and thank my fellow cabinet members for the responsible and daring decision to launch this operation. The goals of the operation have already been fully achieved now.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Friday declaring end of Israel's operation in Gaza. This after the Islamic Jihad militant groups early on Thursday announced a ceasefire with Israel, ending 2 days of heavy fighting that left at least 34 Palestinians dead. Like previous ceasefires between Israel and Gaza-based armed groups, the United Nations and Egypt were instrumental in mediating this one as well. However, the ceasefire is under pressure. There have been reports of renewed Israeli air attacks. A lasting ceasefire also appeared tenuous as the two groups, as Israel and Islamic Jihad militant groups, differed on terms. Residents in Gaza staged a protest.
In a week from now, in 2 weeks, in maximum a month, we will get back to the routine of Qassam rockets, running to shelters, children in fear, and with all the desire for a ceasefire, I am not so happy.
The fighting broke out early Tuesday after Israel killed a senior commander of the Islamic Jihad militant group. This sparked Israel's heaviest fighting with Gaza militants since May. Islamic Jihad fired some 400 rockets towards Israel, while Israel responded with scores of airstrikes. However, Gaza's ruling Hamas militant group, which is much larger and more powerful than Islamic Jihad, stayed out of the fighting, indicating it would be brief. The rocket fire crippled life not only across Gaza but southern Israel as well, as non-stop air raid sirens cancelled schools and forced people to remain indoors. Much of Gaza resembled a ghost town, with almost no vehicles on the road except for ambulances evacuating wounded.
I saw 2 dead people with my eyes. There is a big material loss in cars and houses. The explosion was big. It's not acceptable to hit a civilian area this big.
Israelis and Arabs have been fighting over Gaza off and on for decades. The Gaza Strip has been under a joint Israeli-Egyptian blockade for more than a decade, where freedom of movement for people and the flow of goods and services is also hampered. Palestinians have been gathering near the perimeter fence to participate in the Great March of Return, a series of weekly protests that began in March 2018, calling for an end to the 12-year-old land and air siege. Many of these protests have also turned violent. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
In World Panorama, we'll take a very short break, and after the break, we tell you about this week's car bombing in Afghanistan, the violence coming in the backdrop of governor's prisoner exchange with the Taliban. All the details on situation in Afghanistan on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. Australia is reeling from deadly bushfires and the worst drought in decades. 4 people have died in this year's blazes, which have been exacerbated by hot, dry weather. More than 1,300 firefighters continue to battle the flames that have ravaged the states of Queensland and New South Wales this past month. About 150 fires are still burning in these 2 states, and temperatures are forecast to pick up again into the weekend, leading to fears of more strong blazes. Experts say that drought and the fires are the most urgent symptoms of Australia's climate crisis.
Australian residents on Wednesday surveyed the damage to their homes after destructive bushfires tore through the east coast of the country. Dozens of fires are burning in New South Wales state and about 70 in Queensland. The blazes have claimed 3 lives and destroyed about 1 million hectares of farmland and bush in NSW alone. The fires are fueled by extremely dry conditions after 3 years of drought.
Not good, very emotional.
Yeah.
The amount of work that was put into this place to make it the home it is, and then to lose it in one night with a fire.
On Tuesday, an orange glow was seen descending on Sydney's iconic Bondi Beach as bushfires raged through New South Wales. Health authorities in Sydney urged people with respiratory issues to stay indoors because of the hazardous smoky haze. Bushfires are a common and deadly threat in Australia's hot, dry summers. But the ferocity and early arrival of this year's outbreak in the southern hemisphere spring has caught many by surprise. Fire crews have been battling growing bushfires from the sky by dropping red fire retardant on wooded areas. Most of the emergency warnings issued by authorities for the area told affected residents to seek cover, stating it was too late for people to flee their homes.
It's been a bit of a double whammy for pretty much all of the residents out here because they were hit with Cyclone Marsha in a couple of years ago, and now the other end of the weather spectrum.
Blazes have been spurred by extremely dry conditions in New South Wales and Queensland, which experts say has been exacerbated by climate change. Scientists and experts warn that Australia's fire season has grown longer and more intense due to climate change. Officials have confirmed that 2018 and 2017 were Australia's 3rd and 4th hottest years on record respectively. And last year, the nation experienced its warmest summer on record.
Australia's climate has warmed by just over 1 degree C since 1910. Leading to an increase in the frequency of extreme heat events, and heat obviously does play a role in fires. There has been a decline of around 11% in April to October rainfall in the southeast of Australia since the late 1990s.
Difficult conditions are expected to flare again during the weekend as the temperature rises and winds pick up. Not just humans, wildlife in the area have been badly affected. A photo of a kookaburra overlooking an area burnt by Australia's bushfires went viral on Wednesday, with a native Australian bird seen perched over a branch in the smoke-filled area. Bureau Report, RSTV.
And here is a look at some more international news stories in Global Buzz. Public hearings began on Wednesday in the U.S. House impeachment inquiry, focusing on circumstances surrounding U.S. President Donald Trump's 25th of July phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. At the first public hearings, a top U.S. diplomat told impeachment hearings that President Donald Trump directly asked about a Ukrainian investigation into his Democratic rival Joe Biden. Trump told reporters he did not recall making such comments. Trump is accused of withholding U.S. military aid to Ukraine in order to pressure the country's new president to publicly announce a corruption inquiry into Biden, among the favorites to take him on in the 2020 presidential race. An Arctic air mass has brought record-breaking low temperatures to several places in the United States. The Arctic blast, which began in Siberia, has brought heavy snow and ice to many areas. Daily records have been set in states including Kansas and Illinois. 4 traffic deaths have been linked to the bad weather, and more than 1,000 flights have been cancelled. Schools have also been closed in some areas. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates 30% of the continental US is covered by snow. The World Health Organization on Tuesday said it pre-qualified an Ebola vaccine for the first time. WHO hailed it as a critical step towards its licensing, access and rollout in countries most at risk of outbreaks. This is the fastest vaccine pre-qualification process ever conducted by the WHO. Pre-qualification meaning that the vaccine meets WHO standards for quality, safety and efficacy. The announcement comes after decision last week of the European Commission to allow the release to market of the vaccine made by US laboratory. And Venice's mayor called the city a disaster zone after the second highest tide ever recorded swept through it, flooding its famous basilica and leaving many squares and alleyways deep underwater. This is the worst flooding in the Italian city in more than 50 years. Only once since the records began in 1923 has the water crept even higher, reaching 1.94 meters in 1966. A flood barrier was designed in 1984 to protect Venice from the kind of high tides that hit the city on Tuesday, but the multi-billion euro project known as MOSE has been plagued by corruption scandals and is still not operative. This week saw a car bombing in Kabul. 12 people were killed. It was the first major attack on the Afghan capital after about a month of relative calm. There was no immediate claim of responsibility for the rush hour attack, which came a day after the Afghan government agreed to a prisoner exchange with the Taliban insurgents in the hope of reviving peace talks. The Taliban has so far refused to engage with the foreign-backed Afghan government, which the insurgent group calls a puppet regime. Meanwhile, results from the September presidential elections that pitted Ashraf Ghani against his political rival Abdullah are still pending.
Sounds of ambulance sirens, vehicle damage and burned by blast, security personnel at the site where a car bomb was set off in downtown Kabul, Afghanistan's capital city on Wednesday. The attack taking place around the premises of government offices and foreign non-governmental organizations. Eyewitnesses say the bomb-loaded car charged into a motorcade carrying the experts and set off the bomb. The blast shock waves even passed through a building 100 meters away, smashing all the glasses on the windows facing the explosion site. Nearby residents recall the terrifying moment of the attack. The Ministry of Interior Affairs of Afghanistan confirmed that the targeted vehicles belong to a Canadian security company.
The
explosion was so powerful that crushed glass, shredded car parts, gravels and smoke all gasped into the house nearby. My neighbor's child was cut in the head by glass shreds.
While no one immediately claimed responsibility for the attack, the Taliban and Islamic State are active in the capital and have previously claimed attacks in Kabul. The blast came one day after Afghan President Ashraf Ghani announced that Kabul would release 3 high-ranking Taliban prisoners in an apparent prisoner swap with Western hostages who were kidnapped by the insurgents in 2016. The Taliban prisoners include Anas Haqqani, who was seized in 2014 and whose elder brother is deputy Taliban leader and head of Haqqani Network, group considered to be deadliest faction of Afghan Taliban. The Taliban had kidnapped Australian and American professors in August 2016 from American University of Afghanistan in Kabul. The Afghan government's decision of prisoner swap has been taken in the hope of securing direct talks with Taliban, which has hitherto refused to engage with what it calls an illegitimate puppet regime in Kabul.
تصمیم گرفتیم که 3 تن از زندانیان طالب را که از کشورهای بیرون
We have decided to release the members of the Taliban prisoners. In consultation with the international partners of Afghanistan, and in particular the United States, we have put in place a mechanism and a way that the conditional release of these 3 will not mean strengthening the ranks of the enemy and intensifying their attacks.
این 3 نفر عبارتند: آجی مالی خان، دیوالی خان زوی، عبدالرشید محمد عمر زوی، انس جلال الدین زوی.
Over the past year, the US and Taliban had been seeking a deal that would bring insurgents to table for peace talks with Kabul and allow the US to begin withdrawing troops. But US President Donald Trump abruptly ended the negotiations in September, citing continued Taliban violence. Meanwhile, attacks by Taliban continue, killing not only Afghan government officials but hundreds of innocent civilians as well.
A negotiated political settlement among Afghans is the best path to achieving this outcome. Until that is accomplished, we will continue to pursue an aggressive military campaign against the Taliban and terrorist groups that continue to conduct violence against the people of Afghanistan.
In the midst of this, political uncertainty in Afghanistan also continues. Preliminary results from Afghanistan's presidential election have been delayed for a second time, citing technical faults. The September 28 poll was marred by record low turnout and bickering between incumbent President Ashraf Ghani and his chief rival, Abdullah Abdullah. The election was meant to be cleanest yet in Afghanistan's young democracy, with a German firm supplying biometric machines, but nearly 1 million of the initial votes were purged owing to irregularities, meaning the election saw by far the lowest turnout of any Afghan poll. The ongoing uncertainty raises possibility of Afghanistan headed for a repeat crisis that followed in last presidential election in 2014. Then Ghani and Abdullah fought a close and angry race that sparked widespread allegations of fraud and saw US step in to broker an awkward power-sharing agreement between the rivals under a unity government. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And it is time to wrap up the program. But before I go, I want to introduce you to Lulu, the therapy pig. Yes, pigs might not fly, but can make your air travel less stressful. 5-year-old Lulu and her owner are part of San Francisco Airport's program that brings the trained therapy animals to the airport. With that pilot's cap and her toenails painted bright red, Lulu raises a hoof in greeting, poses for selfies and entertains the departing passengers with a tune on her toy piano. I surely need that pig when I travel next week to cheer me up and help ease my travel anxieties. So here is bringing Lulu, the therapy pig, for you. Bye-bye.